Adeline Mercer stepped down off the evening coach in Fort Sperry, Wyoming Territory, with one battered suitcase, $43 folded flat inside her Bible, and a marriage letter she had read so many times the ink had gone pale at the creases. She was 31. The men, loafing on the depot bench, looked her up and down, took in the full breadth of her. And one of them said something behind his hand that made the other two laugh. The plank platform smelled of coal smoke and sage and the first hard cold coming down out of the Redstone Range. Her suitcase was tied shut with a length of clothesline because the clasp had broken outside Cheyenne. The mountains stood bone-pale behind the town, their high shoulders already gone white for the winter. The rancher who had sent for her took one long look and did not climb down from his wagon. "You'll want to stay on that coach," Josiah Vane said. "I've 3 girls and a blind old man and a place going under, and no use for a wife who'll break on the first hard day." She did not answer that. She only shifted her grip on the wooden ladle handle that stuck up out of the mouth of her suitcase, and breathed and settled her split-toed boots flat on the frozen boards. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The team stamped and blew. A yellow dog trotted across the empty street and vanished under the boardwalk. Somewhere a loose shutter banged in the wind that came off the pass, and Adeline felt that wind go clean through the worn wool of her coat like it had been sent ahead to test her. She had crossed 3 states to stand on these boards. She had sold her mother's good scissors and her 1 silver thimble in Ogallala to buy the last leg of the journey. There was no coach out of Fort Sperry that she could afford, and both of them knew that a woman did not fold her whole savings flat inside her Bible unless the Bible and the $43 were the last of what she had. "I'll not break," she said. Her voice came quiet and level. "You've not watched me try." Josiah Vane worked his jaw under a red-brown beard gone rough with neglect. He was a big man worn down hard, a widower a year and a half into a grief he had not set down for 1 day of it, with deep-set eyes that had forgotten how to look for anything but the next loss coming. He had written the letter in a black week in September and hated himself for it in every week since. He had pictured, if he had let himself picture anything, a small, quick woman who would keep the house and mind the girls and ask him for nothing. He had not pictured this wide, plain, study stranger with a ladle in her suitcase and her chin held level against 3 men laughing. And the meanness in him, the tired, debt-bred meanness that hard luck grows in a proud man, wanted to say so to her face. But the light was failing, and the cold was mean, and there was nothing waiting for him back up the valley but 3 motherless girls, a blind father, and a cold stove in a house that had stopped smelling like a home. So he jerked his chin at the wagon bed. "Get up, then. Don't say I sold it to you as anything it isn't." She lifted her suitcase and climbed up unassisted, which she took note that he did not offer, and she settled her weight and folded her raw red hands in her lap and looked straight ahead down the road out of Fort Sperry while the town watched her go. The storekeeper stood in his lit doorway. 2 women by the pump leaned their bonnets together. The man who had laughed on the bench called out something after the wagon, and she chose not to hear it, and the wind took it off across the flats, and she was glad. She had learned a long time back how to go deaf on command. It was a thing a woman built as she was built learned early. The way a child born left-handed learns to get along in a right-handed world, you did not meet the world's cruelty head-on and try to win. You only stopped giving it a soft place to land. Her mother had never learned it, and had gone to her grave bitter about 100 small unkindnesses. Her grandmother had learned it so completely that a jeer slid off her like rain off waxed canvas. And men who rode up into the hollow to gawk at the granny woman stayed to be doctored and rode home grateful. Adeline had chosen her grandmother's way. She sat in the jolting wagon with her eyes on the whitening mountains and let Fort Sperry say whatever it pleased. The truth she carried, the truth she had put in no letter, was that she had not come out to Wyoming for a husband. She had come for a place to be needed before she got old and died unneeded. She had buried a decent young husband and a baby son in the same Kansas spring 9 years back, cholera taking them both inside 1 week while she nursed them and lived. And after that she had cooked in other women's kitchens and doctored other women's children and grown season on season into a woman nobody looked at twice except to say something about her size. And one gray morning she had read Josiah Vane's advertisement in a paper a lodger had left folded on a chair. A widowed rancher wanting a wife who could cook and keep a house and was not afraid of hard. High country, 3 young daughters mentioned in a single stiff line like a thing he was ashamed to need help with, and something in her that had been asleep for 9 years opened one eye. 3 little girls without a mother. A cold house up a cold valley. That was not a burden to Adeline Mercer. That was a calling with a road to it. The road to the Vane place ran 11 miles up into the foothills of the Redstone Range, past drift fences with the wire down, and gates hung crooked, and a creek already skinned over with the season's first ice. Adeline read the land the way a person reads a tired face. She saw the good under the neglect, grass that would carry stock if a body had stock left to carry. A stand of timber that meant winter fuel, a sky so wide it made a person small and, in a way she could not have explained, made the smallness easier to bear. She did not speak. Josiah did not speak. The wagon jolted upward, and the mountains went from bone to blue to the deep bruised purple of dusk, and she breathed the cold, clean air down deep and let it steady her. The ranch house, when it finally showed, was a low log building with a lean-to-kitchen shouldered onto the back, a barn gone silver gray with weather, and one thin ribbon of smoke leaning off the chimney into the dark. A single lamp burned in one front window. As the wagon rolled into the yard, that lamp moved behind the glass, and then the door opened, and shapes came out onto the porch and stood in a stiff, uncertain cluster, watching the wagon the way barn cats watch a stranger's boots. 3 girls, and behind them an old man's shape in the doorway with a hand on the frame. She had known the number from the letter, and still the sight of them there in the failing light closed something in her throat. The eldest stood tall and thin and furious, maybe 14, a girl trying to be a woman and a mother both before her time and hating every hour of it. The middle one, 10 or so, hung a half step back with her arms crossed hard over her chest, and the littlest, 4, maybe 5 at the most, stood clutching the eldest's skirt with one fist and her rag doll gone gray with love in the other. Staring up at the wagon with a naked, hungry hope she was too small yet to hide. In the doorway the old man turned his blind face toward the sound of the wheels, milk-eyed and listening, one big worn hand resting on the head of a hound. "Girls," Josiah said, and that was the whole of the introduction he made. "This is her." Not one of them said a word. The eldest, whose name Adeline would learn was Ruth, looked at the wide of her and the clothesline-tied suitcase and the plain, wide face of her, and made a small sound in her throat that her father did not check. The middle girl, Pearl, tightened her crossed arms, and the littlest, the one with the doll, whose name was Susanna, but who everyone called Suki, stared up with that painful hope until she caught her big sister's face, and then she hid the hope away and looked at the porch boards instead, and something in that 4-year-old's practiced hiding hurt Adeline more than all of Fort Sperry's laughing had. Adeline climbed down from the wagon on her own. She stood in the frozen mud of the yard in the last blue of the light, and she looked at each of them in turn, slow, unhurried, the way you would let a wary horse take the smell of your hand. Then she looked past them through the open door at the dark, cold kitchen beyond, and she saw the thing she had crossed 3 states to find. She saw a stove gone out. She saw a table bare of everything but a tin of crackers. She saw a house where nobody had cooked a true supper in a long, long time. "Well," she said quietly, to none of them and to all of them, "let's see about getting you fed." She walked up the porch steps past the row of them, and none of them followed, and she stepped past the blind old man in the doorway, who turned his listening face to follow the swish of her skirt and the tread of her boots, and said nothing. And she went into the cold kitchen alone and set down her suitcase and rolled her sleeves to the elbow. The stove was a cast-iron range, good iron gone black and greasy under neglect, the firebox choked with dead ash. Shoved to the back of it against the wall sat a cookpot, a big 3-legged cast-iron kettle, the kind of pot a body could feed a whole threshing crew out of. And it, too, had been let go, a crust of some long-ago meal dried hard and sour in the bottom. She lifted the lid. The smell that came up was old and gone off. Somebody's mother had cooked in this pot once, and cooked well she could tell by the deep seasoning under the neglect, the way you can tell a good blade under rust. Then somebody's mother had died, and the pot had gone cold, and the girls had gone hungry on crackers and beans, and the whole house had held its breath a year and a half, waiting to see who would give out next. Adeline Mercer set the lid down, soft. She found the ash bucket by feel in the dark. She knelt at the firebox in her travel dress, with the road mud still on her hem, and she cleaned it out handful by handful, and she laid the fire the way her grandmother had taught her. A nest of fine shavings, a teepee of kindling, the split wood laid on after, and she struck the match, and the flame caught and steadied and grew, and for the first time in a long cold, while the vain kitchen began, slowly, to warm. She had next to no larder, half a sack of flour with the weevil in the bottom of it, a rind of salt pork gone waxy, a crock of milk half turned, some withered potatoes and a sprouting onion in the root cellar, a double handful of dried beans, a little cornmeal, and this she found pushed to the back of a high shelf, forgotten, a twist of dried thyme and wild sage in brown paper, a dead woman's summer garden put up and never opened. It was not much. It was, to a woman who knew her business, enough. She had cooked from less. She had once fed a hay crew of 11 on a laying hen too old to lay, and a sack of cornmeal, and a jar of somebody's pickled beans, and the men had ridden off swearing it was the finest meal of their lives, which it had not been. But a hungry man's memory is a generous memory. The trick was never in the ingredients. The trick was patience and salt and time, and the plain knowing that the whole difference between slop and supper is attention, which was the one thing nobody in that cold house had spent on a meal in a year and a half. Adeline moved through the strange dark kitchen, learning it with her hands. Where the good knife hung, how the oven drew its heat, which floorboard creaked so she would know the tread of anyone coming, the same as she had learned a dozen kitchens before it, and by the time the fire had the range warm, she had the shape of the room and the shape of the supper both. She scrubbed the cook pot out with sand and lye and hot water until the old iron came clean and dark and true. She rendered the salt pork slow and careful. She built a broth off the bones and the drippings, and the last of the sweet in the turning milk, and she cut the potatoes and the sprouting onion into it, and the beans she had set to soak in her 1 tin cup at the last stage stop, and she rubbed the pork with the dead woman's sage, and she made from very nearly nothing a thick, plain, honest stew. And she baked a pan of cornbread in the oven off the same fire. The smell of it filled the cold house and went out under the door and out into the yard, where 3 girls stood in the dark, not knowing what to make of the thing that was happening to their home. It was full dark when she set the pot down in the middle of the plank table with the wooden ladle standing straight up in it, and lit the second lamp and stood back. Josiah came in from the barn with a cold on him and stopped short in the kitchen doorway. She watched his face and saw it do a thing he plainly did not want it to do. Saw a 1.5 years of grief and cold suppers crack open for 1 second at the smell of his dead wife's sage, and then she watched him shut it away hard behind his eyes. "Girls," she called, quiet, out the door into the dark. "Supper's on." They came in one at a time, weary, half-starved, none of them wanting to be the one who wanted it. Ruth last and stiffest, Suki first, and Can't Help It fast, with the gray doll still gripped in one fist. The old man was led in by Ruth's hand at his elbow and seated at the head. And Adeline understood without being told that this was Josiah's father, and that he was blind, and that the seat he was set in had been his a long time. There was, she saw, one other chair. A chair drawn back a little from the table, worn smooth on the arms, that nobody sat in and nobody looked at, and she understood without being told whose chair that had been, and she did not go near it. She stood at the stove and ladled out bowl after bowl and passed them down the table, and the girls looked at the food and looked at their father, and Josiah, jaw set, picked up his spoon first so they would not have to. The room went quiet in the good way, the way a room goes quiet when hungry people are finally, truly eating. Adeline watched little Suki empty her bowl and hold it up without quite daring to ask, and she filled it again. And the child breathed "Thank you, ma'am," so low it near got lost in the fire crackle, and Pearl kicked her under the table, and Suki's small face shut like a door. And Adeline let on she had seen none of it. She ate last and least, standing at the stove. And she said not one word about how any of them ate. When the pot was empty, she scraped the ladle clean against its rim and hung it on the nail by the stove where a ladle belongs. The blind old man had eaten slow and careful, and when his bowl was empty, he set his spoon down and turned his milk-white eyes toward the stove where the sound of her working was. And he said, in a voice like a rusted hinge that had not been much used lately, "You cook near as good as my Clara did, girl. I'll not say better, but near." And then he got up and felt his way to his corner and sat, and it was the longest speech anyone in that house had made to her, and Adeline held it quiet in her chest and did not answer it, because some things a person had better not answer for fear of breaking them. That first night she slept on a pallet by the warm stove, because there was nowhere else, and she did not mind it. She lay in the firelight and listened to the strange house settle around her. 3 girls breathing up in the loft, the old man's rattling breath from the corner, Josiah's heavier breath through the wall. The wind working at the eaves, and she held the truth of where she was quiet in her chest and did not let it frighten her. She had married a stranger who did not want her, to mother 3 girls who did not want her, in a house with a blind old man and a dead woman's chair on a ranch that was going under. She had done harder things. She had buried a husband and a baby in one Kansas week and got up the next morning and gone on living, and nobody had laughed at her for that, though it had been harder than any laughing. She breathed and settled and slept. Up in the loft that first night, the girls held a whispered council in the dark, the way children do. Ruth said the woman would be gone inside a month, the way the one hired girl their father had tried last spring had been gone inside a week, taking one look at a blind grandfather and 3 wild, grieving girls and a mountain of work, and fleeing back to town on the next wagon. Pearl agreed, because Pearl mostly agreed with Ruth. And little Suki, half asleep, said into the dark that the new lady smelled like biscuits, and Ruth told her to hush. And she hushed. But she lay a while after turning the gray doll in her small hands and thinking about the second bowl the lady had filled without being asked, and the soft way she had said, "Supper's on," into the dark. And she decided, in the private courtroom of a 4-year-old's heart, that she would like the lady to stay even if her sisters would not. She kept that verdict secret. It felt dangerous to want a thing that hard. Below them, through the plank wall, Josiah Vane lay awake too. He could smell his dead wife Clara Sage in the walls of the house now, and it took him apart in a way he would not have admitted to a living soul. For a year and a half the house had smelled of cold ash and unwashed girls and grief. Now it smelled like a supper Clara might have set. And the wrongness and the rightness of that fought in him half the night. He had told the woman to stay on the coach, and he had meant it, standing in that yard looking at a wide-plain stranger he could not feed and did not want. But she had walked into his cold, dead house and lit his cold, dead stove and fed his girls and his blind father the first real supper any of them had eaten since the burying. And she had done it unasked and uncomplaining, without one word about the poverty or the mess or the 4 pairs of hostile eyes, and Josiah Vane, lying there in the dark, could not make that fact fit the shape of the woman he had already decided to send away. He resolved to send her back all the same come spring when the pass is cleared. He told himself that plainly. Then he breathed in the sage and did not sleep. Morning came gray and bitter. She was up before any of them, the fire built back, the pot on for porridge, when Josiah came through pulling on his coat and stopped short at the sight of her already at work in his kitchen. "You don't have to earn your keep the first morning," he said, and it came out of him rougher than he intended, the way most everything came out of him now. "I'm not earning anything," she said, not looking up from the pot. "I'm cooking breakfast. There's a difference. Sit down and eat before you go out to the cold." He looked at her a moment. Then he sat, and he ate, and the girls straggled down and ate, and the blind old man was led to his place and ate. And it was the second warm meal in that kitchen in a year and a half, and the strangeness of it sat on all of them, and none of them named it. So it began. The days took a shape. Adeline rose first and cooked, and while the porridge went, she swept a year and a half of grief out the door, the ash and the dirt and the mouse mess and the cobwebs, and something less nameable along with it. She scrubbed the plank floor down to pale wood. She boiled the girls' clothes and mended the rents, and there were a great many rents. She found the dead woman's mending basket and her button jar and her receipt book, 3 soft pages in a fading pencil hand, tucked into the flour bin against the damp, and Adeline read those pages by lamplight like scripture and cooked from them, and if a girl caught the taste of her own mother's exact way with a bean or a biscuit and looked up sharp, Adeline let her look and said nothing at all. The girls did not thaw all at once. That is not how children thaw. Suki came first, because she was littlest and her want was biggest, and inside a week she was underfoot in the kitchen, handing things, learning the names of the herbs, and Adeline let her stand on a stool and stir the great pot with a wooden ladle held in both small hands, and told her she had a cook's arm. And the child glowed for an hour after. Pearl came next, the middle one, drawn to the warmth the way a cold thing is drawn, sitting in the corner, braiding a horsehair rope and pretending not to listen while Adeline hummed. And the blind grandfather came. In his way, he took to sitting near the stove of an afternoon where the warmth was and the sound of her working, and he would tell her, unasked. The old stories of the valley, the winter of the deep snow, the year the antelope came down in their thousands, the building of the first schoolhouse in Fort Sperry, and Adeline listened and learned the country through a blind man's memory, and the two of them grew easy together the way the very old and the patient sometimes do. Ruth stayed hard longest. Ruth, the eldest, who had been 14 and mother to 2 little sisters, and nurse to a blind grandfather, and keeper of a grieving father's house for a year and a half, who had held the whole broken family together on her thin shoulders with a fierceness that broke Adeline's heart to see. Ruth looked at this wide, calm stranger walking into her kitchen and taking up her burdens, and could not. Forgive her for it, because to lay the burden down would be to admit how heavy it had been, and a girl who has carried too much for too long does not always thank the hands that come to help. She watched Adeline with her mother's receipt book like a hawk watches a shadow. And one gray afternoon in the second week, Adeline came in from the hen house to find the 3 soft pencil pages gone from the flour bin, and Ruth standing white-faced and defiant by the stove with the last curl of them going to ash in the firebox. Adeline did not raise her voice. She had learned long ago that a raised voice is a door slammed. She only stood there a moment looking at the ash where a dead woman's hand had been, and then she looked at the furious, frightened girl, and she said, quiet and steady, I know whose kitchen this was. I know whose hand wrote those pages. I've not come to take her place. Nobody could, and I'd not want to try. I came to feed you. That's the whole of it. You can hate me the entire time you eat, and I'll fill your bowl just the same. She paused. But you'll not burn what's left of your mother again, not while I'm cooking on her stove. She is in the seasoning of that pot, girl, and in the way you all like your beans, and in the sage in these walls, and you can't burn that out of the house no matter how hot you build the fire. Ruth's face for 1 second was 14 and motherless and terrified, and then it was hard again, and she pushed past Adeline and went up the loft ladder and did not come down to supper. But she never touched the pot again, nor anything of her mother's. And the next morning, though she would sooner have died than admit it, she ate. If you've made it this far into Adeline's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I have been waiting to tell you, because the peace of that kitchen was a small, warm thing. And outside the reach of it, the ranch was still dying, and Adeline had been a married woman on the Vane place only 3 weeks when she came to learn exactly how close to the edge the whole family truly stood. She learned it the way she learned most hard things, by the arithmetic. Josiah kept his accounts, such as they were, on a shelf in the front room in a cracked leather ledger and a bundle of papers tied with string, and one evening when he had gone out to a calving heifer, she sat down with the lamp and read them. not to pry, but because a woman cannot cook a family out of trouble if she does not first know how deep the trouble runs. And the trouble ran deep. There was a note held against the Vane place by the Fort Sperry Bank, $310, borrowed 2 hard years ago against the coming of better years that had not come, the interest riding on top of it, and the whole of it come due the 15th of January. Beside the note, in the smooth hand of the man who held it, was a name she would come to know: Harlan Cruz, banker, who had bought up the paper on half the failing spreads in Redstone County and was in no hurry at all for any of them to pay, because a note paid was only money, and a note called was a ranch. $310. She had 43, less what the journey had eaten, and now some coins besides. She sat a long while with the ledger open and the lamp low, and did the arithmetic of it over and over, and there was no arrangement of the figures that came out to hope. And then she closed the book and put it back exactly as she had found it, and she banked the fire. And she lay down on her pallet, and she did not sleep, and somewhere in the small hours she stopped trying to find $310 in the ledger and started instead thinking about the one thing she owned that the ledger could not measure. She could cook. And a town that will not lend a proud rancher $1 will still, every single one of them. Pay 2 bits for a bowl of good hot soup when the day is cold and the cans in the cook tent are down to beans. She had turned a town's opinion with a cook pot before. She thought perhaps she could turn one again, and a turned opinion on a frontier is worth more in the end than a bank's money, because a bank forecloses in silence and a town does not. Fort Sperry that winter had a hunger in it waiting to be fed. The town sat where the freight road up from the railhead met the road down out of the mountains, and it was full of men passing through and men working through, teamsters and tie hacks off the timber contracts, drovers, a survey crew wintering over, the hands off the big spreads, come to town on a Saturday. And the one eating house in Fort Sperry was a mean little place run by a sour man named Dooley, who watered his coffee and burned his beans and charged for both. There was, in short, a town full of cold, hungry men and no honest hot meal to be had among them, and Adeline Mercer, doing her arithmetic by the lamp, saw the whole shape of it plain. She rented the cold, empty room off the back of the harness shop for near nothing, because it had a stove and a door onto the street, and had sat useless for a year, and she scrubbed it out over 2 days the way she had scrubbed the Vane Range, and on a Thursday noon she had the cookpot going. She had hauled it down the 11 miles in the wagon, the Vane pot, because it was the pot she trusted. And a great steaming kettle of beef and barley soup rich, with marrow and the last of the false carrots, and pans of hot biscuits, and coffee a man could stand his spoon up in. She had spent near her last $1 and most of her flour on it. It was everything she had, in a pot, and she stood behind it in her flour-dusted apron in the cold back room and waited to see if a single soul would come. The old ranch hand came. His name was Toomey, a bandy-legged old cowboy the Vanes had kept on half out of charity because his roping days were behind him, and he had ridden down on some errand and smelled the soup and come in shy, and he ate, and then old Toomey went out and told the others, and by the time the light was going, 9 men had come behind him, sheepish, half ready to sneer at the fat rancher's wife playing at a cook shop, and they ate. And the sneer went off their faces with the first spoonful away weather goes off a sky, and there was that good quiet again, the quiet of hungry men finally fed. And when the pot was near empty, a teamster, named Boaz Kell wiped his bowl with the last of a biscuit and looked up at her and said, "Ma'am, I'll pay you 2 bits for that any day you'll set it in front of me." And he laid the coins on the plank counter. And one by one the others laid theirs down after, and Adeline Mercer stood behind her cookpot with her raw hands folded and did not let them see what it did to her. She had not been sure they would pay. She would have fed them free and counted it money well spent, because a town's whole opinion turns on its stomach, and she needed Redstone County's opinion turned before the 15th of January far more than she needed its quarters. But the quarters came, laid down one on another on the plank counter. Silver in the thin cold light through the harness shop window, and Adeline counted them that night at the ranch by the lamp, $2.25 out of a single pot of soup, and she sat a long moment with the little stack in front of her and did the arithmetic. If 9 men on a Thursday made better than $2, then 20 men 3 days a week made. And here her breath came a little short, because a woman who has folded her whole savings flat in her Bible does not take a $2 sum lightly, near $13 or $14 a week, if it held, if it grew, if the fever of plain curiosity that brought men to gawk at the fat bride's cooking hardened into the settled habit of hungry men eating well. It was not the half of $310. It would not clear the note, but it was not nothing. And nothing was very near what she had had a month before. She banked the coins in a lard tin and hid the tin in the flour bin and blew out the lamp and lay down, and did not sleep for the arithmetic running warm behind her eyes. Word of a thing like that runs a frontier town faster than a grass fire. By the next Thursday there were 20 men. By the Thursday after, she was cooking 3 days a week, and then 4, and the men paid their 2 bits, and some paid more, and some who had no coin at all split her a rick of stove wood, or brought her a hind quarter of venison, or a sack of their own mother's put-up preserves. And Adeline kept it all straight in a ledger in her steady hand, and did the arithmetic every night by the lamp. She took on old Toomey to haul and wash for her, glad of the work his stiff hands could still do. She was up before dawn on the Vane place, cooking for her own, then driving the 11 miles to town to cook for other people's, then driving home in the black cold to cook a third time and put the girls to bed, and she did it on 4 hours sleep and a straight back, and the Vane girls, watching her go and go, began, even Ruth, to understand what was being done, and for whom, and by whom. The women of Fort Sperry were slower to come round. Women always are, about another woman, and Adeline did not hold it against them, having been a hard-judging young woman herself once, before life sanded the corners off her. The wives of the town had their own reasons for weariness. A cook-room full of single men was a scandal-shaped thing to a careful woman, and the plain stranger who kept it was a vain now. Wed to the hardest-luck widower in the county, and there was the old ugly arithmetic that a homely woman's kindness must be a play for something. So they watched her from across the street and from behind their curtains, and said their small, cool things, and Adeline cooked and waited, because she had learned long ago that you cannot argue a town's women into liking you. You can only be in front of them day on day exactly and only what you are, until the plain being of it wears the suspicion smooth. The first to cross the street was the widow who kept the mercantile, a hard hickory knot of a woman named Winifred Salt, no soft edge anywhere on her. She came into the harness shop kitchen one Thursday and stood a while in the doorway with her mouth set. and watched Adeline feed a table of teamsters, and watched grown rough men say please and thank you to the fat bride like she was their own mother, and at last she crossed the floor and admitted, stiff as a woman confessing a sin, that her flour had been moving off the mercantile shelf faster than it had in a year on account of a certain new cook, and that fair was fair. And she had been raised to say so when a thing was so. Adeline wiped her hand on her apron and put it out, and Winifred Salt shook it, one hard pump, and allowed she would hold Adeline's flour at the fall price clean through the winter, as a matter of business and not of friendship, and Adeline said she would take it as business and be glad, and the two of them understood one another perfectly. And neither would ever have called it friendship, and that was the beginning of the town's women turning. But it was the fever that turned it all the way, and the fever came out of a hard early winter that seemed, looking back on it, to have been sent for no other purpose than to test what the county was made of. The first killing storm came down out of the pass the second week of December, 3 days of white wind that shut the road, buried the drift fences, and killed a dozen head up in the timber. And when it blew itself out, it left a still, deep, marrow-cracking cold behind it, the kind of cold that gets down into the lungs of a town already worn thin. And with the cold came the sickness. It started in the tie hack camp up the timber contract, where men lived rough and close in a single long bunkhouse, and it was the bad kind. A black diphtheritic throat fever that closed a man's windpipe from the inside, that took the children worst and the weak worst, and moved from cabin to cabin faster than the one old doctor could ride. Doc Pryor was near 70 and worn to the bone, and within a week he had 30 sick up and down the valley, and no way on God's earth to be in 30 places at once, and people began to die. The tie hack camp was hit hardest. Then it came down the timber road into Fort Sperry proper. Boaz Kell, the teamster, took it. 2 of Winifred Salt's stock boys took it. And then, riding the cold up the 11 miles the way the wind rode it, it came to the Vane Ranch, and it took Suki. It came on the child fast, the way it takes the little ones. The small girl with the gray doll went hot in the loft in a single gray afternoon, and by dark her throat had begun to close, and she fought for every breath with a hard crowing whistle that was terrible to hear. And her fever ran so high she did not know her sisters, and Josiah, that hard man, stood over his youngest daughter's bed with his big hands hanging useless at his sides, and the look on. His face of a man watching the last of his family slide away from him into the same dark that had already taken their mother. This was the low point. This was the middle of the night in the middle of the story. The blizzard cold and the closing throat fever and the banknote all closed in at once. The 15th of January, 5 weeks off, and no money to meet it, and now a dying child. And Josiah Vane broke in a way Adeline had not yet seen him break. He turned to her across the firelit loft with his little girl fighting to breathe, and he said, "Hoarse, stripped clean of all his hardness, do something. Please, you're the only, I don't know how to, do something." And Adeline Mercer rolled up her sleeves. She had been raised by a granny woman in the Kansas breaks, a woman who had doctored a whole county before there was a licensed doctor within 50 miles of it, and Adeline had forgotten none of it. She sent Ruth to the woodpile to build the fire high and keep it high. She sent Pearl to melt clean snow by the kettleful. She set the blind grandfather, who could not see to help but could not bear to sit idle, to feeling out the herbs on her shelf by their smell and their leaf, and handing them to her as she named them. And the old man's hands, that had lost the world, found this one small useful thing in the dark, and did it steady. And she put the cook pot on, not for stew now, for medicine. She built first a true bone broth, deep and long simmered and salted, the kind of broth that feeds a body that cannot swallow anything solid, because a child with a closing throat starves as surely as she smothers if a body cannot get some nourishment past the swelling. And she made her grandmother's throat steam, a great kettle of water gone bitter with the barks and the wild herbs she named off one by one to the blind old man's careful hands, set to boiling hard so the whole loft filled with the medicinal steam of it, because her granny had sworn that the black throat fever hated moist, warm air the way it loved cold, dry, and would loosen its grip in a room made into a steam tent. She hung wet sheets from the loft rafters to hold the steam close about the child's bed. She spooned the warm broth between Suki's cracked lips, a single drop at a time, endless, patient, through the long night. And she brewed her granny's fever draught, the fever bark steeped down with yarrow and a bitter willow she had put by, and a spoon of wild honey to make a small girl take the bitterness, and she dosed the child through the black hours and swabbed her swelling throat with a honey and a lum wash on a clean rag wound round her own finger. And she sat where a mother sits, and did not sleep, and did not stop, and did not let go. It was the longest night of Adeline Mercer's life, and she had known some long ones. There was an hour, the black hour just before the turn, when the child's breath went so thin and so tight, and the crowing whistle so faint, that Adeline thought she had lost her, thought she was going to have to stand up off that loft floor and turn to a father and two sisters and a blind old man and tell them the littlest was gone, the same as their mother was gone. And something in her went cold and steady as pond ice, because that was how she had learned to carry the unbearable. You went cold and steady, and you did the next thing and the next thing, and you fell apart later, in private, if at all. She wetted the sheets again and built the steam back up. She got one more drop of warm broth past the closing throat. She talked to the child low, called her back, told her there were spring lambs coming she would not want to miss, and a gray doll on the pillow gone lonesome for its girl, and Ruth, the hard eldest sister, knelt on the other side of the bed all that black hour and talked too, hoarse and scared and stubborn, telling her baby sister about the trout in the creek and the good sledding hill and the way. The meadowlarks would come back over the pass in the spring, keeping her tethered to the world of living girls. And Josiah stood in the loft doorway all that hour with his fists clenched and his face a ruin, and could do nothing, and had to watch the wide plain woman he had meant to send away fight for his daughter's life with a spoon and a pot and a granny's book. And he never forgot 1 minute of it as long as he lived. The fever broke a little before dawn. Adeline felt it break under her hand, felt the killing heat go out of the child's brow all at once, and a terrible swelling in the small throat begin, by slow degrees to give, and the breath come easier, the crowing whistle softening down toward a true, ragged, sleeping breath. She got a good spoonful of broth down her then, and it stayed, and the child sank into the first real sleep she had had in 2 days, and Adeline sat back on her heels on the loft floor and breathed. And only then, with her back to the others, did she let 2 tears fall and no more, and she wiped them on her apron and stood up and said, "Steady, she'll do. She'll be weak a good while. Somebody bring me more clean snow to melt, and keep that kettle boiling." Josiah Vane stood in the loft, looking down at his sleeping daughter, And then at the wide plain woman he had told to stay on the coach, and something in his hard, grieving face came apart for good and did not go back together the old way. But Adeline was already thinking past her own house. If the throat steam and the fever drought had pulled Suki back, then they could pull back Boaz Kell. And Winifred Salt's 6 stock boys, and the tie hack camp, and whoever else in that worn-down county was strangling on the black fever, while one old man rode himself to death trying to reach them all. She left Suki in Ruth's keeping, and a steam kettle and pearls, and she loaded the cook pot and every herb off her shelf into the wagon in the gray first light, and she drove the 11 miles down into Fort Sperry through snow to the horses' knees, and she found Doc Pryor Gray, faced with exhaustion asleep, sitting up in his own front room with his boots still on, and a dead child in the next room. He had not had the strength to carry out. She woke him gentle. She told him what she had, and what she had done, and what she had watched work. He was too tired to be proud, which is the one reason it took. A man with more strength left in him might have sent the fat rancher's wife and her granny medicine packing. But Doc Pryor had watched 4 people die that week that he believed he could have saved with rest and steam and broth and a body to sit up nights. And here was a body, and she had brought a pot. And he was out of everything now but grief. "Show me," he said. She showed him. And by that noon the harness shop kitchen, her cook shop, had become a fever house, the cook pot going day and night. Adeline brewing draughts and boiling broth and bitter steam by the gallon, while Winifred Salt and the doctor's wife and 2 of the church women who had turned their shoulders on her, turning them the other way now, carried it out steaming to the sick of Fort Sperry in tin pails through the snow, and set up steam kettles in the worst-hit houses the way she showed them. Adeline organized it the way a general organizes a battle, calm and quiet in the center of the storm of it, and she taught the women her granny's draught and her granny's steam so that the medicine could go where she herself could not. And she rode up to the tie hack camp in the timber, the worst hit place of all, and worked among the roughest men in the county 3 days and nights, and pulled Boaz Kell the teamster back from the edge with steam and bark and stubbornness the same as she had pulled back the child. The days ran together into one long amber-lit labor. She could not go home to the ranch, the road was bad, and the sick kept multiplying, and Josiah sent Ruth down through the snow with clean clothes and word that Suki was mending stronger every day. And Ruth, seeing what her stepmother had built in the harness shop kitchen, the ordered chaos of it, the women who a month before had scorned her now taking her quiet orders like soldiers, the old doctor deferring to her, the sick of the whole town calling her name in the dark, Ruth went home and did not say much, but she scrubbed the whole vain house top to bottom and had a hot supper on the stove when her father came in from the barn, which was how a 14-year-old girl says a thing she cannot yet say out loud. Adeline slept 3 hours a night on a cot in the harness shop back room and rose in the dark and started the pot again. Her hands cracked and split at the knuckles from the lie and the cold and the endless washing, and she wound them in clean rag and kept on. She lost weight she could spare and sleep she could not, and she never once, in all of it, spoke a hard word or asked a thing for herself, and the county of Redstone, watching her burn herself down to the wick to save its people, learned a thing about the woman it had laughed at on a depot bench that it would be a long time forgetting. There was a night deep in it when she thought she had lost the survey captain's little boy, the fever gone so high and the throat so near closed that the child went blue and still. And Adeline worked over that little boy the whole night the way she had worked over Suki, the same cold, steady ice inside her, the same steam, the same bitter draught, the same low voice calling a child back from the far edge, and near dawn the swelling gave, and the breath came, and the color came back, and the survey captain, a hard-educated man from back east, who had thought little enough of frontier granny medicine, sat down on the floor of that rough kitchen and put his face in his hands, and Adeline laid her cracked hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to be said that a kettle of steam and a spoon of broth and a long night had not already said better. 30 and more sick across the county, and by the third week of it, when the fever finally burned itself down and out, all but 3 of them lived. 3 were lost. The child Doc Pryor could not save before she came, an old man already dying of a bad heart, and a tie hack too far gone in the camp before anyone reached him, and Doc Pryor told the story of those 3 weeks for the rest of his life, and told it always the same way, that a rancher's wife with a cookpot and a granny's book had done the work of 10 men and saved more of Redstone County than he had, that he would have buried 30 souls without her, and that the whole county ought to be ashamed it had ever laughed at the woman on the depot bench. The county heard him. A county hears its doctor. And the laughing stopped. But laughing stopping does not clear a note at a bank, and the 15th of January came on hard behind the fever, and the Vane Ranch was still owed for, and Adeline driving home worn to the bone from 3 weeks of nursing. Did the arithmetic one more time by the lamp, and found that everything she had earned and saved since October, her Thursday 2 bits and her cookshop coins, $131.80, kept honest in her ledger, was not the half of what Josiah Vane owed Harlan Cruz. It was not close. She had fed the county and saved its children, and it had not been enough. And the 15th was 4 days off. She sat with that a long while in the firelight. And then she did the last thing she had left to do, which was the thing that frightened her most, because it meant standing up in front of the whole county that had laughed at her and letting them see her need. Asking did not come easy to Adeline Mercer. Giving came easy. She had given her whole life, her cooking and her doctoring and her strong back and her sleepless nights, given, and asked for nothing, because asking was where a plain woman got laughed at. Asking was where the world got to say no to her face. Her whole life had been arranged so she would never have to hear the world tell her no again. But the ranch was owed for, and the 15th was 4 days off, and her $131 was not the half of it, and pride is a fine thing to keep warm under at night, but it will not clear a note at a bank. So she thought it through the way she thought everything through, cold and steady, and she saw that she did not have to ask the county for herself. That she could not have done. But she could stand quiet and let the county do a thing for the Vane girls and for the ranch that had fed the town all fall and nursed the whole valley through the fever, and there was a world of difference between the two, and the difference was the whole of it. She would not go to the courthouse to beg. She would go, with her girls and her husband and the blind old man, to stand and lose the ranch with dignity if it came to that, and she would trust the people she had fed and doctored to be the kind of people she had believed them to be when she fed and doctored them. She sent quiet word to 3 she had nursed, old Toomey and Boaz Kell, and Doc Pryor, that the note came due on the 15th, and that having given her share of help, she would not be too proud to see help offered. That was the whole of her asking. Then she left the rest to a frontier's long memory for a debt of the heart, and she banked the fire, and she slept. The note came due at the county courthouse on the 15th, because Harlan Cruz had let it be known he would foreclose in the open, before the whole town, the way he foreclosed on every failing spread whose paper he held, so that everyone would see what became of a man who could not hold his ground, and everyone would learn to fear the bank. He meant it as a lesson and a humiliation both. It was his way. Josiah dressed that morning in his one good coat, gray as a man walking to his own hanging, and Adeline dressed too, in her clean pressed calico and her mended apron, and they loaded the girls into the wagon, all three, Suki wrapped in blankets and thin and pale but mending, and they led the blind grandfather down by the hand. And they drove the 11 miles down to Fort Sperry to lose the ranch in front of everyone. The courthouse was raw whitewashed board, and it was full. Cruz had made sure of the audience. He did not yet know he had made sure of the wrong thing entirely. He stood at the front in his good black coat, with the deed papers laid out, and the county sheriff beside him, dry and smiling. And he read out the debt in his smooth banker's voice, $310 and the interest riding on it, against the Vane place, come due and unpaid. And he asked, as the territorial law obliged him to ask, whether any party present had cause or coin to stay the foreclosure, expecting silence, expecting the pleasure of the silence. And old Toomey stood up in the back. Toomey stood up on his stiff, bandy legs, the legs that had put him out of the saddle and into Adeline's kitchen, and he said, "I'll cover $3 of it, and it's the best $3 I ever laid down. That woman fed me and give me honest work when I was too broke down to rope, and she nursed half this town besides." And he limped forward and laid $3 silver on the courthouse rail. Then the teamster Boaz Kell stood up. $10, he said. "She fed my whole crew all fall for 2 bits of bowl when we were eating cold out of cans, and she sat up 3 nights and pulled me back from that black fever when the doc had give me up. $10, and it's owed, not given." Then Doc Pryor stood, 70 years old, and the whole room went quiet for him. "I am an old man, and I have not got much," the doctor said. "But I have got $25 in my coat this morning, and I never in all my life spent money to better purpose. That woman saved this county. All of you know she did. Cruz knows she did. I would have buried 30 of your neighbors this winter, and your children among them, and I did not. And the whole reason I did not is standing quiet at the side of this room right now." And he laid it down on the rail. And then it broke open, the way a thing breaks open when the first honest man says the true thing out loud. Winifred Salt, from the Mercantile, $15, and a hard nod across the room at Adeline. The doctor's wife, whatever was in her purse. The church women who had turned their shoulders. The survey captain from back east, who stood up in his good coat and pledged $50 in one breath and said the woman had saved his only son and he would have paid 10 times it, and thought it cheap. The tie hacks down out of the timber camp, rough men, dollar by hard-earned dollar. Boaz Kell's whole crew. A rancher from the next valley who had heard the fever story and stood and pledged the price of 3 head of beef. Farmers and teamsters, a widow, the blacksmith, the storekeeper, who had laughed on the depot bench that first evening and could not now meet her eye. The coins and the bills came down onto the courthouse rail in a growing heap, while Harlan Cruz's smooth face went first white and then a mottled, ugly red. Because a foreclosure is a quiet cruelty, and it cannot live through a whole town standing up. In the light, Adeline stood at the side of the room with her girls and her husband and the blind old man, and did not move, and did not speak, and let the county she had fed and doctored do the talking now. She had not asked for this. She had only 4 days before gone quiet to 3 of the men she had nursed and said the ranch was owed for. And would they let it be known that having given help, she would not be too proud to take it? She had trusted that a debt of the heart gets paid on a frontier. She had been right. They counted it on the rail. $341.50 in silver and paper, and 1 gold piece from the survey captain, gathered up from a county that had laughed at her 10 weeks before. Enough for the note, and the whole of the interest, and better than $30 over. The sheriff counted it twice. Cruz demanded he count it a 3rd time, and it came the same, and there was nothing in the law he could do, because the law asked only whether any party had coined to stay the foreclosure, and the party of the entire county had answered him. The sheriff turned to Cruz and said, dry as Cruz had ever been to any poor man, notes covered, Harlan, signed the release. And Harlan Cruz, before the whole of Fort Sperry, had to take up his own pen and sign away the ranch he had waited 2 years to swallow, and he did it with a hand that shook, and he did not once look at Adeline. And when it was done, he put on his good hat and walked out of the courthouse into the cold, and got up into his fine buggy and drove back to his bank, and the county let him go. Nobody chased him. Nobody jeered. He was simply, all at once, a small man in a good coat that no longer frightened anyone, and that was punishment enough, and Adeline, watching him go, felt no triumph in it, only a great tired quiet, which was how she knew her grandmother had raised her right. Outside the courthouse, in the thin January sun, the county gathered around the Vane family in the trampled snow, and it was Josiah, of all people, who could not speak, Josiah, the hard-luck silent man, standing in the street with his ranch saved, and his 3 girls around him, and his blind father's hand on his shoulder, and his wife beside him, and his mouth working, and nothing at all coming out of it. It was Adeline who spoke. She thanked them plain and short, no speech in her, and she said the one true thing, which was that there was a pot of soup on at the harness shop kitchen, because there was always a pot of soup on, and any who were cold or hungry were welcome to it, no charge, today of all days. And near the whole of Fort Sperry walked down the snowy street behind her and ate from her cook-pot in the cold. And it was the finest supper any of them ever told of after. They drove home that evening up the 11 miles with the ranch still their own, and the girls slept in the wagon bed in a heap under the blankets, all 3. Suki's head on Ruth's shoulder, Ruth's arm around her baby sister without her thinking about it at all. And the blind grandfather rode up on the seat with his face turned into the clean cold wind and something like peace on it, and Josiah drove, and Adeline sat beside him, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The mountains stood black against a sky gone thick with stars. The cold was clean. And somewhere past the halfway mark Josiah Vane cleared his throat and said, low, not looking at her, I told you to stay on that coach. You did, she said. I was a fool. You were grieving, she said. It wears the same face as foolishness. From the outside sometimes. He drove a while. Then he said the hardest thing he had to say, the thing that had been coming since the sage in the walls, since the first warm supper, since the loft and the long night. I don't know how to say what you've done. For my girls, for my father, for me. I sent for you to keep a house, and I've watched you save the whole of us, and I've done nothing the entire time but doubt you. His voice caught and held. I don't deserve it, and I don't know how a man thanks a person for a thing like that." Adeline was quiet a long moment. Then she reached over in the dark and laid her raw, cracked hand over his big one on the reins, the first time she had touched him, and she said, "You could quit thanking me and start living like a man who means to keep me." That would do. And Josiah Vane, hard-luck rancher, widower, turned in the starlight and looked at his wife for the first time as a wife. And something long frozen in him settled and gave and warmed, the same slow way a cold kitchen warms when at last somebody builds the fire. And he turned his hand over under hers and held it the rest of the 11 miles home. Winter came on in earnest after that, the true deep Wyoming winter. And it was a hard one. But it was not a cold house they weathered it in. The ranch, with the note cleared, could carry its stock to the spring without ruin, and Adeline's cook shop brought in steady coin all through the frozen months when the ranch brought in none. So that for the first time in 3 years, the Vane place went into deep winter with a full larder and a stocked cellar and a little money set by in the lard tin. She put up preserves and dried her herbs against the next fever season, and she taught the girls their letters by the fire on the long, dark evenings, all 3. Because she found out Ruth had let her own schooling go to keep the house and was ashamed of how much she had forgotten, and Adeline gave it back to her without once making a shame of it. And by spring Ruth read the newspaper aloud of an evening in a clear, steady voice, and Josiah listened to his eldest read and looked at his wife across the firelight and did not need to say the thing his face was saying plain. The winter evenings took on a shape as good as the days. After supper, with the pot scraped and the ladle hung on its nail, and the wind walling the snow up against the cabin, Adeline would set the older girls to their reading and little Suki to her letters on a slate, and the blind grandfather would tell his valley stories into the warm dark. And Josiah would mend a harness or a hinge at the far end of the table, and the house would fill up with the small warm sounds of full and living house makes, the scratch of a slate pencil, the pop of the fire, the old man's low, rusty voice, Suki snoring against Adeline's side where she had fallen asleep half through her letters with the gray doll under her chin. Adeline had spent 9 years in other people's houses being useful and unremarked, sleeping in narrow beds in back rooms, and she had told herself she wanted nothing more than that, a place to be needed before she died. She had been wrong, and she knew it now, on those long lamp-lit evenings, with a sleeping child heavy against her ribs and a good hard man at the other end of the table stealing looks he thought she did not catch. She had wanted this. She had wanted it her whole life and been too sensible to admit it, and here it was, snowed in with her and hers. She taught them more than letters. She taught Pearl the whole shape and order of a kitchen until the middle girl could set a supper by herself. She taught Ruth, who had the steadiness for it, the names and the uses of every herb on the shelf, the barks and the yarrow and the bitter willow and the throat steam, all her grandmother's granny medicine, and Ruth wrote it out in a careful hand in a copybook and drew each plant beside its name. And that copybook would one day be a real thing in the valley, though none of them knew it yet. She taught little Suki, who was too small to be taught much, to stand on her stool and stir the pot and feel herself important, which is the most a body can teach a girl of 4, and plenty. And she gave the blind grandfather back a use for his hands and his memory both, and gave the girls back their father a piece at a time, until the house that had held its breath a year and a half learned how to let it out again. The dead woman's chair, Clara's chair, drawn back a little from the table, that nobody sat in. Adeline never once sat in it, not all that winter. But one evening near the turn of spring, little Suki, mending and grown bold and full of a small child's clear sight, climbed up and sat in it herself, in her mother's chair, and looked around the table, half afraid she had done a wrong thing. And nobody said a word for a moment. And then Ruth, the keeper of the family's grief, said gruff and soft at once, "Ma'd have liked you sitting there. Runt." And that was the moment the last of the ice went out of the house. One small girl in her mother's chair and her big sister giving her leave. And Adeline, at the stove with a ladle in her hand, had to turn and face the fire so they would not see what was on her face. And the found family she had gathered without ever meaning to came up the 11 miles all that winter and after, the way such people do on a frontier, arriving uninvited with a thing in their hands and a question in their mouths and a flat refusal to be thanked for it. Old Toomey, no longer a charity case, but the cook shop's own hand, drove out in the worst of the cold with a haunch of elk over his shoulder and asked was there wood wanted splitting, and split it whether there was or not, and stayed to supper. Winifred Salt came out with a bolt of good wool she had over-ordered and could not sell, which was a plain lie, and cut and sewed the 3 girls their first new dresses in 2 years at the Vane kitchen table, and asked Adeline, gruff, had she eaten, and made her sit while she did. Boaz Kell hauled out a load of winter feed at his own cost when the Vane hay ran short, and asked did they want anything brought up from town of a Saturday, and came the next Saturday regardless of the answer. And old Doc Pryor drove out through the drifts once a fortnight to teach Adeline the doctoring her granny had not known, and to be taught, in his turn, the doctoring the granny had, and the 2 of them would sit at the plank table over the steaming cook-pot, arguing herbs and fevers like a pair of gray professors while the girls did their letters. And it was, the old doctor said once, the best company he had kept since his own wife passed, and he came out the next fortnight regardless. The county of Redstone made her something like famous, in the small way a frontier county makes a person famous. They called her Broth, the thing that had stopped the black fever, and her stew the thing that had saved the Vane ranch. And mothers came out the 11 miles to have her look at a sick child, and she never turned one of them away, and never took more than they could give. Doc Pryor, before he died 3 winters on, taught her all the doctoring he knew that her granny had not, and asked her to keep at it when he was gone, and she did. The Wide Plain bride the whole county had laughed at on a depot bench ended her days the nearest thing Redstone County ever had to a second doctor, and was buried, when her time came, a long while after, under a stone the whole county paid for together. But that was all still ahead. That first spring, when the pass opened and the grass came green up the foothills and the first Vane lambs dropped healthy in the new sun, Josiah took Adeline up to the ridge above the ranch one gold evening to see it. The mended drift fences the girls had worked all winter, the fat spring grass. The house with real smoke standing straight off its chimney, the sound of 3 girls' voices carrying up from the yard, and the old man's laugh among them. He had never been a man for words. He put his arm around his wife, and they stood in the long golden light and looked at the thing they had saved together, and after a while he said the only thing he could find, which was, "I'm glad you didn't stay on that coach." "So am I," said Adeline Mercer, who was Adeline Vane now, 31 years old and home at last. And she leaned into him and breathed and settled, and they went down together to their supper, The sun was going down behind the bone-pale mountains, throwing long gold light across the yard, and the first stars were coming out one at a time over the range. In the warm kitchen the cook-pot steamed, on the good iron stove, full of the evening stew, and around the plank table sat 3 girls who had learned again how to be daughters, Ruth and Pearl and little Sukey in her mother's chair, and a blind grandfather who had a family around him again, and a father who had learned again how to be one. And they were loud in the good way, the way a full table is loud. Adeline stood at the stove with the great wooden ladle in her raw, capable hand, and she filled bowl after bowl and passed them down the table, the same as she had that first cold night, only nothing at all was the same. Because that first night the house had been dying, and now it was alive. She had come with 1 suitcase tied shut with clothesline and $43 folded flat in her Bible and a letter from a man who did not want her. She was 31, and they had laughed at her on the depot bench, and she had cooked them all quiet, one warm supper at a time. Toomey, who stood up first at the courthouse, and Doc Pryor, who said the true thing out loud, and Winifred Salt, who put out her hard, honest hand, and Boaz Kell, whom she pulled back from the black fever, and a whole county that had learned in the end to be ashamed of its own laughing. She hung the wooden ladle back on its nail by the stove where a ladle belongs, and she sat down at last, not in the dead woman's chair, but in her own place at Josiah Vane's right hand, and she breathed, and she settled, and she ate.